Yes. So the questions, questioning as a method of inquiry, and the answers which are given to us, they lead to some kind of emancipation. So questioning alone that gave rise to the possibility of a dialogue. Dialogue is known as the pre-theoretical surrogate of dialectics. Now I'm moving to the other lecture that is on dialectics. But the dialectics as a theory loaded phenomenon, you know, its pre-theoretical surrogate can be found in the dialogues only. So uh, in the dialogue, we do not have many concepts, theories are the principles. But when we come to dialectics, it has various operative terms, and there are various theories and principles. So it is very elevated methodology in philosophy. Questioning as an attempt to understand the meaning of life and death, knowledge and immortality, bondage and liberation, Brahman, Atman, etc. But in the dialogue, in the dialectics, we find that there is a movement of ideas from less adequate to something which is more adequate. So, in fact, in the dialectics, so ideas and discussions take place on a reality which is dynamic in nature. It is not something which is fixed kind of a thing. So, in the Greek philosophy, philosophers had thought that reality is made up of things. When we started moving forward, we find that with Newton, the reality was understood in terms of things and events. And this is how Kant and others also thought about it. But when we come to dialectics, particularly in Hegel and Marx, then things do not exist, only the events exist. And events are always dynamic. Hegel is the one, in fact, who thought that Heraclitus was the first dialectical thinker, because Heraclitus wanted to understand reality in terms of change. Though he had not much developed it, and if we read Plato's dialogues, we generally find that Heraclitus has not been regarded as a great philosopher, because one of Heraclitus' student, Cratylus, he later on became the student of Plato also. And he had mentioned once or twice about Heraclitus in the dialogues with Plato. Besides that, we have no other, nobody has mentioned about Heraclitus. It goes to the credit of Hegel alone, who made Heraclitus a philosopher, because Heraclitus started thinking in terms of change. What is change? There are two types of changes. One is reversible and the other is irreversible. Reversible changes are quantitative in nature, like increase in the quantity or the decrease in the quantity that makes a change. But irreversible changes are like biological changes, chemical changes, certain social changes, that we arrive at a stage when it is not possible to reverse it. So for a fairly long time, philosophers only thought in terms of quantitative changes. But in dialectics, quantitative changes lead to qualitative changes. This issue came up very substantially. So uh, two issues are very important here. One, that Heraclitus' attempt to understand philosophy in terms of change is what gave birth to dialectical thinking. And second, the dialogue with its operative terms of agreement and disagreement gave birth to the you know concept of to the method of dialectics, dialectical method. It came up very substantially in the course of time. Now, if we look at the dialogue of Socrates, which Plato has articulated, in fact, we do not know who the Socrates was, We know Plato's Socrates. It's only Plato who made Socrates a philosopher. Just as, you know, Nagarjuna made Buddha the philosopher, or Heidegger made Herder, Hölderlin the philosopher, or Kant made Herder a philosopher. This way, because when the philosophers start writing on somebody, then the person becomes a philosopher. Like same is about Gandhi also. That when philosophers started writing on him, then Gandhi became a philosopher. So Margaret Chatterjee wrote, Richard Sorabji wrote, Akhil Bilgrami wrote about, you know, so many philosophers have written on Gandhi. So Gandhi has become, though Gandhi had accepted that he is not a philosopher. So this issue is something which has come up very substantially. So in dialectics, we generally find that there is a movement of ideas from less perfect to something which is more perfect and much more. And there is an expectation that we should arrive at something which is absolutely perfect. So it's there in all the philosophers. Then the uh, the movement from abstract ideas to the abstract ideas is one-sided attempt to understand it. Rather, in dialectics, the abstract ideas participate with something which is concrete, and the concrete reality also has to be made possible, participate in the abstract ideas. So it is this kind of a thinking which goes on. To understand the uh, dialectics, eh, let us just try to see the way Immanuel Kant has tried to articulate it and present before us. So, in his Critique of Pure Reason, what Kant has done in the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, he says, and this is very something which is very substantively there. Uh, he has said that human reason has this peculiar fate that in one species of its knowledge, it is burdened by questions which, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. That means there are certain questions which are inevitable to come to us. It is impossible to avoid such questions. And at the same time, it is also not possible to answer to those questions. I would like to make little reflection on this issue because this is where the method of dialectics is very substantially used. Kant, in fact, thought that dialectics is a logic of illusion in the sense that, for instance, in the dialogue, when the dialogue goes on, we find that various ideas are all brought together, and in those ideas, some ideas are more adequate and other ideas are less adequate. So those ideas which are less adequate, they are repudiated. So that means ideas are shown to be false, some ideas, and some ideas are shown to be true. And in the process of showing that the ideas are false, the falsity refutes itself. So in the dialogue, falsity refutes itself. Similar is the case with dialectics also. Here, certain questions emerge, and in our attempt to try to articulate and present it, we find that it's just not possible. The ideas are, you know, I can give some examples of it. For instance, the in the context of antinomies, in the third part of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant has said that the world has a beginning in time and also is limited as regards space. This is the thesis he has proposed. And then he comes to the antithesis of it, in which he says that the world has no beginning in time and is not limited as regards the space. Now both the positions are, you know, wrong. That's why Kant becomes anti-relativist also. Both the positions are wrong in the sense that, you know, to answer the question that the world has a beginning in time and a limit in space, for that, we need the whole world to be given to us in our sensible intuition. That is not possible. So we cannot make any judgment on such questions. But at the same time, we cannot ignore such questions because these are bound to occur to us. So this is how it goes about, and there are four such pairs of antinomies which Kant has given. And he was trying to develop an epistemology based on synthetic a priori judgments, and those judgments are propounded in order to uh, repudiate Newtonian Humean skepticism and establish Newtonian physics, because Hume's skepticism was, intended to repudiate Newtonian physics, causality, and mass energy dualism, and universal law of gravitation, mathematical foundation of the physical world. All these things are to be, regarded as something which has to be repudiated. And uh, uh, Kant wanted to save Newtonian physics, and in his attempt of doing so, he was trying to, answer Hume's skeptical challenges. So, for Kant, dialectics becomes some kind of a logic of illusion. The world as a whole is some kind of an illusion. Kant calls it as transcendental illusion, not empirical or the logical illusions, which can possibly be understood and repudiated in the course of time. But transcendental illusion can neither be proved nor disproved. So this was the position which Immanuel Kant had it, and in case of soul, he had advocated this position that paralogisms of reason, where soul cannot be understood in terms of substance, in terms of simplicity, in terms of its relation to other objects, because for that we require that the soul is given in some kind of sensible intuition, and this is virtually not possible. This is in fact not possible. Uh, but the substantive development takes place when we come to Hegel. Hegel was the one who, in fact, gave certain principles to dialectics, and he gave a new meaning to dialectics. And in order to give that new meaning, he reinterpreted the concepts like the three sources of knowledge: sensibility, understanding, and reason, which were there in Kant's philosophy. And in case of sensibility, Hegel said that there is no way to accept that there is a thing in itself which is not given in the sensibility. In fact, when we look at an object, we look at it in terms of its entirety. So there is no question of any mysterious thing in itself behind the veil of appearances. Second thing is about understanding, which creates, contradictory concepts. And you know, in the second part of in the second logic, that is called logic of essence, Hegel has advocated number of such categories which are mutually contradictory, and the job of understanding is to create such contradictions, and then comes reason to create unity between them, unifying the opposites. So that is the function of reason, very substantial. The first glimpse of Hegel's dialectics we find in his phenomenology of spirit, where he has taken up the an episode between master and slave, master-slave dialectics, or the dialectics of bondage and liberation. So that kind of a thing. And it's a beautiful place where, in fact, it is with this kind of a dialectics that we can understand society also. And in a very metaphoric sense of the term, Hegel tries to understand the mind of a master who is always looking for a slave in order to satisfy his requirements. And if we look at the mind of the slave, then his mind is always preoccupied with the requirements of the master. So in the mind of the master, there is an image of the slave, and in the mind of a slave, there is an image of the master. This is how the social relationships are articulated in terms of contradictions. Contradiction is the source and vitality of everything. All kinds of movements take place because of contradiction. So in fact, in his Science of Logic, Hegel has said that everything is inherently contradictory, and in the sense that this law, in contrast to others, expresses rather the truth and essential nature of things. Contradiction is the root of all movement and vitality. It is only insofar as something has contradiction within it that it moves, has an urge and activity. This is from his book Science of Logic, uh, book 2, and it has been translated by A.B. Miller. Very good statement he has given, that contradiction is not something which has to be, resolved. The way Kant had thought about it, that the antinomies have to be treated separately, is not the case that what Kant thinks about it. So Kant has in fact uh, tried to reinterpret Kant's sensibility, understanding, and reason, and he reformulates the limits of the categories which Kant had, because Kant has only 12 categories, and for Hegel, there is no limit to the categories, in the sense that every now and then we float certain new categories, and and this way it goes on. Kant has also tried to repudiate, Hegel has also tried to repudiate Kantian thing in itself and nominal kind of a thing. And he has expanded the horizons of the phenomenal world. He has tried to resolve the antinomies which Kant could not resolve. So that way he is trying to formulate the categories and the concepts in a very substantive manner.